Hello, my name is Giovanna, also known as Joe. I'm so excited to publish my first podcast episode ever with my new podcast, Cup of Joe with Joe. We'll be talking about different topics. We're going to dive into the past and explore our history, as well as take a closer look at the strange and mythical legends and my favorite, true crime. So get your cup of Joe and coziest blanket as we learn about the good and bad about us. Let's get started. On the morning of September 16, 1810, a day like any other, people were getting ready for their day on the fields. Unlike other days, though, the church bells are ringing unexpectedly. Families are pushing each other to get to their small Dolores parish. Father Miguel Hidalgo is ringing the church bells. The congregation goes silent as Father Hidalgo starts to speak, and he says, "My children, a new dispensation comes to us today. Will you free yourselves? Will you recover the land stolen 300 years ago from your forefathers by the hated Spaniards? We must act at once." With his banner bearing the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, Father Hidalgo proudly proclaims, "Viva la independencia, mueran los Gachupines." Long live independence, death to the Spaniards. This was the ray of hope everyone was hoping for to start the revolution. So, why were the Mexicans trying to gain independence from the Spaniards? Let's start at the beginning, on November 8, 1519. 500 conquistadors, along with their leader, Hernán Cortés, finally arrived to the capital of Tenochtitlan and was greeted by Emperor Montezuma II. Cortés, in his notes of the encounter, mentions that Montezuma immediately recognizes the divine right of the Spanish and the Catholic Church to rule these lands, and he surrenders his empire immediately. Although, I don't know about you, but when I first read this, I thought it was a joke. I don't know if I have ever read of a ruler being thankful and gracefully, without a word of protest, gives up their people, let alone their empire. Of course, there is a story written by the Spaniards that says Montezuma thought Cortés was the god Quetzalcoatl, a white-skinned god, but this account was written 50 years after the encounter. So, as NPR put it, here is what happens. The story of the Spanish conquest, as it has been commonly understood for 500 years, goes like this. Montezuma surrendered his empire to Cortés. Cortés and his men entered Tenochtitlan and lived there peacefully for months until rebellious Aztecs attacked them. Montezuma was killed by friendly fire. The surviving conquistadors escaped the city and later returned with Spanish reinforcements. They bravely laid siege to Tenochtitlan for months and finally captured it on August 13, 1521, with the Spanish taking their rightful place as leaders of the land we now know as Mexico. Conquest accomplished. Please keep in mind, this surrender came after skirmishes and a massacre of an indigenous village that Cortés encountered during his search for the Aztec Empire. This was not an immediate surrender, and it was not peaceful. Others pose this more like the Spanish-Aztec War, but that is a story for another time. The Spanish portrayed the Aztecs and other indigenous groups as uncivilized, savage barbarians. That was obviously not true, but through this portrayal, the Spaniards established a new social group called a caste system. The caste system was a rigid socio-racial classification. Basically, their race influenced their social status, rights, and opportunities. For this portion, we will need to learn a couple of terms. There were a few categories that were used in order to classify people. These categories come from indigenousmexico.com. There were peninsulares, individuals born in Spain, holding the highest social status and privileges in the colonial hierarchy. Españoles, or the Spaniards, those born in Spain or the other colonies, positioned at the top of the hierarchy. Criollos, or Creoles, children of the two Spaniard parents born in the colonies, typically occupying high social and economic positions but ranked below peninsulares. Mestizos, children of a Spanish parent and an indigenous parent, often facing societal limitations. Mulattos, children of a Spanish parent and an African parent, generally placed lower in the social hierarchy. Sambos, children of an indigenous parent and an African parent, typically at the lower end of the social scale. Castizos, children of a mestizo parent and a Spanish parent, often considered closer to the Spanish lineage. Moriscos, children of a mulatto parent and a Spanish parent. Tresalvos, children born from a union of a Morisco parent and a Spanish parent, often considered a step towards cleansing the lineage back to Spanish purity. We won't be using all these terms today, but I thought they were important since you can see that the only ones in power were the ones that had some sort of Spanish in them. Yet even then, the ones in power were the Spaniards. Now, let's go forward to the 1700s. Who is Father Hidalgo? Father Hidalgo was a Criollo priest who was born into a moderately wealthy family in the city of Guanajuato, northwest of Mexico City, in 1753. He went to school to become a priest, and soon after being ordained into the priesthood, in 1778, he earned the animosity of the authorities by openly challenging both the church doctrine and Spanish rule by developing Mexican agriculture and industry. In 1803, Hidalgo accepted the curacy of a Spanish parish in Dolores, not far from his native city of Guanajuato. Between 1803 and 1810, he directed most of his energy to improving the economic prospects of his parishioners. Hidalgo started a pottery complex and a brick-making plant, grew trees for silkworms, set up a tannery, and cultivated bees, olives, and grapes. If he had any additional time, he spent it learning Indian languages and reading. As many others were, a lot of Mexicans were joining secret societies. Hidalgo also joined the Academia Literaria, a secret committee seeking Mexico's independence from Spain. Part of the reason why there was such a push for independence during this time was due to the fear that Spain would relinquish control of Mexico over to the French, who were represented as godless. So this committee developed a plan called the Conspiracy of Querétaro. This conspiracy was a plan by a group of criollos to overthrow the peninsulares. They assumed that criollos and mestizos would join together to fight against peninsulares, not only to stop their suppression by the Spaniards, but also because of the possibility of the French rule. But before they could enact their plan, the Academia Literaria was betrayed in September of 1810, and the Spanish authorities learned of the group's plot to incite a rebellion. On September 13, they searched the home of one of the leaders of the Academia Literaria, Emeterio González, in the city of Querétaro, where they found a large supply of weapons and ammunition. Hidalgo, upon hearing of Emeterio's arrest, decided to take action ahead of time. On September 16, 1810, Father Hidalgo enthusiastically summoned his small congregation of Indians, or the indigenous people, and mestizos. With the support from the Indian and mestizo population, they headed towards the town of San Miguel in Guanajuato, a major colonial mining center controlled by Spaniards and Criollos. As Hidalgo and his ragtag army headed to Guanajuato, the Spaniards and Criollos prepared by barricading themselves in the most fortified building in the city, the Alhóndiga de Granaditas, or the Public Grain Exchange. There's actually a museum there now that I would love to visit. Anyways, the Spaniards' plan was to stay there and ward off attack until reinforcements came to quell the rioters, which would have worked until El Pipila came, translating to the Turkey. Pipila was a disabled man who joined Hidalgo's army. He was nicknamed Pipila because he was born crippled and walked in an unusual manner. On this day, Pipila, who was tormented his whole life by his townsfolk, not fearing for his safety, strapped a large stone on his back, picked out a bucket of tar, grabbed a flaming torch, and ran at the only weak spot of the structure, the wooden door. The rock was able to protect him from the onslaught of arrows from the Spanish and was able to reach the doors. Once at the door, he coated it with the tar and set the tar on fire. He helped twofold. Not only did the fire weaken the solid wood door, but the smoke also limited the sight of the archers, allowing the others to rush at the door. The rioters forced open the door and flooded the building, successfully taking over the building and the city of Guanajuato. This was the first victory which helped inspire the Mexican independence movement. With this victory, Hidalgo's army grew to 60,000, and off they marched to Toluca to prepare an attack on the capital, Mexico City. And while he did have many who joined him, we have to keep in mind his army was a disorganized, untrained army that included women, children, grandparents, and livestock. By October, the rebel army, now 80,000 strong, was in Valle de Toluca, where they encountered a decisive battle against the Spaniards. Hidalgo and his army won, but took severe casualties and many deserted, going back to their lives to harvest fields. And who can blame them? Unfortunately, Hidalgo, fearful of unleashing his remaining army on the capital city, hesitated and retreated to the north. Hidalgo was then captured in Texas, which was still part of the Spanish Empire at this point, where he was defrocked as a priest and executed by a firing squad on July 31, 1811. He was then beheaded by the civil government as punishment for revolting. His head was displayed in Guanajuato, where he and his army were charged with causing a massacre. While this rebellion was shut down, the torch was taken by many others until independence was reached on August 24, 1821. Though we still remember the Mexican independence this month as the time where the flicker of hope started. We remember this time as one of pride. Viva la independencia. And that's the story of the Mexican independence. Let me know your thoughts, and thank you for joining me with my cup of joe.